Our speaker today is Larry Kreisman, the Program Manager of Historic Seattle, and today's presentation is based upon the critically acclaimed book, The Arts and Crafts Movement in the Pacific Northwest.
We have been involved with about 40 projects in the Seattle area that nobody wanted to save, and Historic Seattle was established by the city in 1974 to do good, to essentially be a developer, which the city could not do. So what happened was they gave Historic Seattle, as a public development authority, $600,000 to start off. And so what happened for us was we kept buying buildings, restoring them, and putting them back in the marketplace, selling them so that we had revenue to do the next project. And we are still in that kind of a phase. Our biggest major project the last couple of years has been Washington Hall, which is the Danish Brotherhood Hall of 1908, and it's a marvelous community center. It served for housing for the Danes when they came to the United States. I would like you to take a look at some of the projects we do. We also have a very active education program, probably 25 to 30 programs every year, tours, open houses at private homes and places that people never go. The renowned British designer C.R. Ashby, during his January 1909 tour to the West Coast, presented lectures on the arts and crafts in Seattle. He presented 3 here, he presented 1 in Portland, Oregon. Ashby's letters when he was touring the United States, and by the way, this is a picture of him on horseback with his wife being toured through Seattle in January on a clear morning. And I just wanted you to get a sense of the Northwest, meaning Oregon and Washington, and what the roads and the access to Western Washington were about the time he came out here. Ashby's letters, when he was traveling, are most revealing, because being a very insular Brit, he really didn't know very much outside of English, arts and crafts, and he was quite blunt in his opinions about what he saw on his trip. He despised the work of the Gorham Silver Company, and he called Rookwood pottery rubbish, although he did actually buy some for his shop in London. Unimpressed by what he referred to as the pollution, degradation, crowding in other American cities like New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, he was fascinated and delighted with the West. Ashby wrote in his journals that Seattle was, quote, the only American city I have so far seen in which I would care to live. All the gold of Ophir would not tempt me to live in one of those smug eastern cities. Here is a city with a new light in her eyes. His wife, Janet, remarked on the city's cosmopolitanism, its, quote, well-appointed restaurants decorated with the latest arts and crafts distinction of line and coloring. Now, while searching downtown restaurants today, you won't find any that she ever frequented. She talks about these evoking the ambience of her familiarity in Britain. And you can see in Frederick and Nelson's writing room, in a view of Seattle, in a little poster stamp, that Seattle was really at that time, and Pacific Northwest generally, was participating in a much larger movement, imported design and reform that had roots in 19th century Britain, but really was taken to heart by Americans. The ideals of the arts and crafts movement, which were a celebration of craftsmanship and the creative process, an appreciation of sound construction, planning, proportion, grace, simplicity, a comfortable rusticity that sees beauty in nature and honors indigenous materials, these found fertile ground in Washington and Oregon. The effect was seen in a remarkable variety of public and private architecture, including progressive residences, rustic lodges, and bungalows for everyone. Architects and designers, striving to create environments of domestic comfort, found what they wanted in local materials, in logs and cedar shingles, river rock and stone. Regional distributors assured that the furniture, metalwork, and tile of the most significant American designers were shown and promoted in the Northwest. Departments had special displays on Tiffany and Stickley and Limbert furniture. Public and private buildings, included Tiffany glass, rookwood, and Gruby tile fireplaces and lighting fixtures from Gustav Stickley's Craftsman workshop. One such building is, of course, the Kreisman Mansion, and this is the billiard room in the Kreisman Mansion. Regional architecture clubs organized exhibitions that showcased the nationally and locally known architects and interior designers, but also local ones. Arts and crafts societies trained art workers and hobbyists alike. Handcraft and fine art societies set up exhibits in Seattle, Portland, Eugene, Bend, elsewhere. And there were a lot of regional museums that were the evolution of these early societies. Painting and printmaking, photography, graphic arts, and book design were also pivotal to the national movement and were showcased by local artists and designers. School children were brought up with a respect for handwork and with skills that would stay with them as they built their houses and made furniture, created metalwork and embroidery, china painting, jewelry, basketry, and book arts. The exploration of arts and crafts ideas was inspired by designers in a number of countries who were developing theories and products that quickly came to America. Even as far west as Washington and Oregon, we think of ourselves as frontier, but by the time the railway had established itself, everything was available by train. Everything was available in public libraries. Seattle architect Charles Bebb, whose work in the office of the architect Louis Sullivan in Chicago was very well known, came out to Seattle and he designed a house for Frederick Stimson. Their house on Queen Anne Hill, he did the ballroom in a very Louis Sullivan-esque way. But the William French Company came out from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and did the interiors, and they encouraged the use of the great British artist William Morris. They used his fabrics and wall covers. The British architects C.F.A. Voysey and M.H. Bailey Scott influenced Canadian and American architects to look away from high-style historic eclecticism and to seek out an appropriate domestic style. And an excellent example of this is actually in Ellensburg, Washington. It was designed for Scotsman David Ramsay by Samuel McClure, who was the leading architect in Victoria and Vancouver at the time. Englishman Alfred Bodley, who may have worked at McClure's office, actually partnered with Seattle architect John Graham on several residences, one for the Ferry and one for the Leary family on Capitol Hill in Seattle. He used Donegal woven carpets from Ireland, Tiffany windows, rookwood and Gruby tile, and glass mosaics by one of Frank Lloyd Wright's favorite collaborators, Giannini and Hilgart of Chicago, who did the marvelous mosaic tile fireplace surround. In Portland, leading designers were also inspired by English prototypes. Wade Hampton Pipes actually studied at London's Central School of Arts and Crafts, and his reputation for building English arts and crafts designs actually extended all the way into the 1950s when people were doing mid-century modern. Elbert Hubbard's Roycroft community, which was in East Aurora, New York, had been founded in 1897. Hubbard traveled throughout the country. He was a great promoter. He had lectures in Seattle and Spokane, Tacoma, Portland, Salem, Eugene, you name it, he was there. There was even a Roycroft Day at the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. And the founders of Seattle's Beaux-Arts Society and workshops in 1908 probably modeled their model community on Lake Washington by looking at Elbert Hubbard's magic community in Roycroft. Ideas emerging in other countries were welcomed in the Pacific Northwest. The interiors of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the Glasgow designer, were popularized in the press and account for Spokane architect Kirkland Cutter's marvelous design using Glasgow interiors for the ladies' retiring room at Louis Davenport's hotel in Spokane. All the stenciling on the walls and in the mirrors and the glass windows. Then he borrowed from the Germans and the Austrians in the Orange Blossom Bar and in his own personal dining room and in his living room. In Portland, you have an architect, William Knighton, who was also inspired very much by what was happening in Vienna and in Austria and Germany in terms of moving away from historical design and trying to find a place for new material, abstract, stylish, basically conventionalized ornament. And here are examples at the Seward Hotel. Glass mosaic on the outside, and marvelous abstract designs up here and in the skylight. This is the Governor Hotel if you ever go down to Portland. World's Fairs in Chicago in 1893 and the St. Louis Fair in 1904 gave Oregon and Washington the means to promote themselves to the world. And it also brought consideration of building with native materials and finding a vernacular that really fit the region that they wanted to promote. So you can see it in the Lewis and Clark Exposition and in the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, mostly in the forestry buildings, because the other buildings were done in Renaissance or classical style, but here are the marvelous forestry buildings that really talk of dramatic log buildings, power of the native Northwest forest, and honest construction techniques. The Seattle Fair celebrated Washington's distinct advantage of access to the Far East and Alaska, and embracing the cultural and design heritage of both areas in its Torii Gate, which you can see the designs for up here. Totem poles supporting the cap of that. And you can see it in some of the buildings that were done on the grounds. The Japanese pavilion and the tea pavilion were very popular to tourists. And it probably inspired some of the things that came later. This is a YWCA at Sylvan on the Sound, and this is the transit hub station at Point Defiance Park, which is still there. But probably the log structures that made most impact on people visiting the fair and gave them ideas for their own homes were a couple of fraternity lodge buildings. This is the Brotherhood building up here, and you can see that it's furnished with it was an Alaskan building, and it's furnished with handmade furniture. And Ellsworth Story, who was a Seattle architect who had moved here from Chicago, developed the Hoo Hoo House for lumbermen's fraternity, and he was responsible for not just the creation of this half-timbered, rustic building, but also all of the interior features, including the cutwork, balcony, friezes, lighting fixtures. He also designed all the furniture. These are actually at the university in special collections, these pieces of furniture that he designed. The American Women's League, which was founded by Edward Lewis with the intent of creating community meeting houses nationally, also gave visitors a glimpse of how furniture and textiles could really make a house into a home. And then there was also the Women's Building, which on the first floor had very comfortable mission oak seating for everybody around fireplace, but the second floor housed an exhibit of women's work from around the state. None of it was judged. Everything that was submitted was there. Another building that was very influential on the site was the Education Building. And here was an opportunity for the school districts to show off what they had done in their classroom. In addition to lots of what we call arts and crafts inspired furniture and artwork, they had a demonstration area where, of course, the women were working at their work and the men at theirs. And there certainly were some distinctions between what was expected of each sex. So as a teaching tool, the fair exposed the public to a broad range of design that most of them had never seen. It brought together the wealth of Asia and Europe, Alaska, and America. And while only a small number of the objects that were here or the products could be considered arts and crafts, nevertheless, they were there to see. There was Tiffany glass and the Rookwood pottery. There were metalwork, furniture, lighting, ceramics by professionals, by amateurs, by hobbyists, by students. So visitors at the fair would dine at mission tables, and they would write their letters and postcards at mission desks with slide glass fixtures. And they undoubtedly would go home at night dreaming about how to incorporate these ideas into their present home, or perhaps buying a bungalow or having it built in one of these emerging suburban neighborhoods, what we call the streetcar suburbs. And it was happening in Seattle, but it was happening in Spokane, in Portland, in big cities and small. Now, while the fairs were temporary, what was happening in the downtowns was very much influenced by another major national movement called the City Beautiful, which had the intent of really inspiring good civic practices and moral uprightness by designing buildings of character, beautiful buildings on hilltops so that they were visible if they were public buildings. Buildings generally designed on classical lines, the democratic Greco-Roman. And you see that in a master plan that never got off the board in Seattle, the Vogue Plan in 1911. But you do see buildings going up. This is the Caw Building, one of several buildings of the Metropolitan Building Company. And even though they were classically inspired on the outside, many of them had interiors featuring woodwork and arts and crafts furniture, very simple furniture. And part of the reason was, even if the private clubs and libraries had special rooms with, highly carved mahogany furniture for special occasions, in general, when you had hotels that had large waiting rooms or libraries, or, as in this case, the King Street Station, you wanted furniture that would hold up to abuse and use over the years and wasn't going to be that costly. And Mission furniture, or arts and crafts furniture in the Mission style, seemed to do the trick for many. It may seem incongruous that outside, on the porch outside the Washington State Building at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, these people are sitting in Mission oak rockers, but that's what was happening, and it could have very well inspired people to think of that as acceptable. When they went into the Sorrento Hotel in 1908, they weren't greeted with sumptuousness. They were greeted with a beautiful mahogany lobby, but Mission oak chairs. Where the arts and crafts, the exterior and the interior really melded together were in the lodges and meeting houses and country club houses that were outside of the downtown. This is the Seattle Country Club, and Kirkland Cutter designed a very lovely beam-ceilinged room, and he took the golf clubs as the cue for making his lighting fixtures. So the style of casual, rustic, fitting into the environment fit really well with small inns in, this one's Bend, Oregon. This one is in Southern Oregon on the coast. This was done by Bernard Maybeck, a little hotel. You see it being used, the Craftsman bungalow and Craftsman home being used in small lumber company headquarters in Southeast Washington. And then the Swiss Chalet style was a popular offshoot of this look at rusticity and domesticity. And you see it in this, which is the swimming pool, the natatorium in Tacoma at Point Defiance Park, which is no longer there. So interest in what we call vernacular regionalism grew. And the idea of this rustic simplicity, native materials, hand-built character, as expressed in those exhibition buildings, were realized in informal summer cottages and more substantial townhomes. The collecting of Native American culture became popular as well. Frederick Stimson displayed his Native American baskets in the billiard room of his Queen Anne house. Judge Burke and his wife indulged their collecting interests at their lakeside retreat on Lake Washington. It was called Illahee. And also in their First Hill home, where they asked Kirkland Cutter to design a special room to display their collecting interest. And here it is with its copper hood looking like a teepee. Fresh back from a trip to Switzerland, Ellsworth Story, who had done the Hoo Hoo House, designed two houses, one for himself, one for his parents, in the Denny Blaine area of Seattle. He took the Swiss Chalet sloping roof for his own, and he hand-built this house. You can see him there working on the stonework. A couple of architects trained in Frank Lloyd Wright's studio in Oak Park, Andrew Willitson and Barry Byrne, and this is a small prairie-style house they did on Queen Anne Hill. This is a house by Emil Schacht, who was a Portland architect, and this is one by Lawrence, who was a well-known Portland architect too. Here's a house in Portland by a man named Bennis, who also liked the prairie style, which is the long horizontal look with the ribbons of windows, but he could never quite let the classical style go. So there's a bit more ornamentation on his houses. And then for the absolute California bungalow, you have this building for Mr. Reed down in Portland, Oregon, designed by a Los Angeles architect. So for rich and poor alike, a new American vernacular was really being created to answer the question, what does home mean? And with the streetcar lines making it easier for people to move outside of the commercial and downtown areas to newly platted places, fortunes were made in real estate development, and there were evocative promotional brochures which were very persuasive. And in this niche, the bungalow really found a perfect fit. The local libraries subscribed to House Beautiful, House and Garden, Ladies' Home Journal, and Gustav Stickley's The Craftsman. And the ease with which Stickley made his plans available to anybody around the country is probably seen in this house right across from Frink Park near Leshai. This is the family's home, nice Victorian turreted house. And it was a druggist, a pharmacist, who owned the house. And when his daughter got married, he decided to give her a wedding gift of a house. So he ordered the plans from Stickley. They came about 6 months later, and lo and behold, there's a bungalow on the family property. In Portland, we had similar things happen. This is a house near the Irvington neighborhood that was a Craftsman home plan that was ordered by the family, and then they hired one of the architects locally to make it a little bit more elaborate than the plans called for. But you didn't have to go to Gustav Stickley for your plans, because we had in Seattle a man named Judd Yoho who identified himself as Seattle's bungalow man. And he developed in 1912 and published Bungalow Magazine through 1918. Each month it would come with a ready set of plans that you could get from him, and sometimes you could order it through, he would do it for you. There was the Craftsman Bungalow Company that actually he owned as well, so it was no big deal for him to do everything from start to finish. The magazine was terrific. He promoted himself almost as well as Elbert Hubbard, and so lots of bungalows in Seattle and the vicinity were part of his group of bungalows. Here are a couple of examples. He covered everything. He didn't just cover the building. He covered built-ins, furniture, accessories, textiles. There was even an article on landscape for in and around the bungalow. And then people would either learn from it, or there were sometimes amateur craftsman projects that you could do. Now, Yoho had many competitors. It was a gold mine for lumber companies to try to sell plans to people and, of course, sell the lumber and everything else. So you saw these popping up in Spokane and Portland and Eugene, Bend, Oregon, all had these kinds of promotional vehicles for them. The geographic diversity of Oregon and Washington really lent itself to a variety of outdoor recreational pursuits, leisure time activities, and it provided a healthy environment for people to get away from the polluted city and for recovery from tuberculosis and other diseases. There were sanatoriums, there were lodges, and really inspired by Old Faithful Lodge at Yellowstone Park, we had a rapid development of Rainier National Park and Paradise Lodge, interior. Quinault Lodge and Mount Baker Lodge developed in the later 20s and early 30s, places for people to go and be away from the busyness, the hustle and bustle that we think if we were back there, it wouldn't be hustle and bustle, but it was in those days. Sanatoriums and health resorts did establish themselves, and small bungalows and cottages were constructed in forests and in the seaside. And bungalows were heavily promoted as the ideal solution for people wishing to escape these increasing pressures. Zoe called Kincaid, who was at the Seattle Mail and Herald, captured the value of this lifestyle. She said, "People of modest means build bungalows half hidden by the firs, and but a short distance from the salt water. Some of these homes are of logs and built upon the mountain slope that commands a sweeping view of the water. Others are nestled among the shrubbery, close down in the tide. To own 5 acres of woodland and a bungalow is to live a luxurious and independent life. Year after year, the owners of bungalows return to their homes in the woods. Their children grow straight as pines, learned in watercraft and wood lore. Brought up in the shadows of the mountains, they are taught to be true Westerners, men and women of right living and thinking. These homes ran the gamut. There's Mr. Bernard's home in Alki, a rather lovely log house, which some of you may have visited when it was the Alki Homestead Restaurant. Frederick Stimson and his wife moved out to become country gentry in Woodinville, and this is the main building at Hollywood Farms where Sam Michel Winery is. An expansive bungalow which had lots of space underneath the eaves for lots of house guests. And then the Kleises built their mansion here, and this is the living room area with a copper hearth, lovely woodland frieze around the upper part, which is still intact. And they had specially commissioned furniture, this library table. And then up in the Highlands, Mr. Carey decided he wanted a summer house that really might be a year-round house sometime. And over in central Washington, in Yakima, Chester Congdon, who was from an attorney in Duluth, Minnesota, and had bought lots of property and was doing irrigation and planting apple orchards, had a Minneapolis firm design his castle, a marvelous thing that built between 1914 and 1916. They used to call it Congdon's Castle. They probably still do. Beautiful stained glass windows, wonderful metal work and lighting fixtures. All of it, everything except for the concrete and the stone, shipped out from the East and the Midwest on rail cars directly to the site. Architects realized that this was a great opportunity for them to get into interior design and decorating too, because they could do markups on everything they sold. And so you have examples of a place in Spokane called the Studio. You have advertising for papers, for decoration, for furniture, rugs, carpets by Kirkland Cutter. Some architects love to design furniture. This was the Hoo Hoo House. This is the furniture that was designed by Ellsworth Story. Not terribly comfortable, and I don't think it was meant to be too comfortable because you were supposed to get a little rest in there and then go back to the exhibits. Hampton Pipes, who was the architect in Portland who did English arts and crafts, designed this myrtlewood table and chairs for the Panama Pacific exhibition in 1915 in San Francisco. There was an Oregon room. And Andrew Willitson got involved with designing furniture that was asked of him when he was commissioned by Horace Henry on his Capitol Hill house to design a library with the library table, very much a prairie-style table, and treatment of the fireplace surround. And here's his design for the lamp, which is at the university. There were a number of companies in the Northwest who tried to match what was coming out of the major East Coast furniture companies. Some of them were okay, some of them were cheaply made because they were charging less money and hoping to get people to buy cheap. And then others, like the Kingcraft company in Portland, Oregon, really produced very high quality furniture. And they used to say, well, our furniture costs more, but you're getting what you pay for. Then there were tons of stores, department stores in various cities that were marketing things by the major manufacturers. This is a showroom on Pike Street and Fifth Avenue, the Grote Rankin Company. It's all Limbert furniture. Limbert was a major manufacturer from the Midwest. And here's Limbert furniture in the White Pelican Hotel in Klamath Falls, Oregon. So it did get around. In 1913, the Standard Furniture Company, which some of you may know because it was the Nordstrom rack store for years on Pine Street and 2nd Avenue, actually opened their atrium as a home show. And this is the home show. They built a bungalow complete with river rock pillars and a hearth to show off its Craftsman and its wicker line. glass companies were also a big business. They tended to do a lot of church windows and fraternal organizations, but during this period of time, they started doing residential windows, and in Portland and in Seattle, you'll see occasionally stained glass windows and skylights and fan lights. In Portland, the Povey Glass Company was one of the major firms, and they actually started producing lighting fixtures as well. Edward Bruns, who probably worked on that Seward Hotel project with that glass mosaic, also was well known in Portland for doing largely arts and crafts designs. And then in Seattle, there was the Belknap Glass Company, and a person who worked for them, Raymond Nyssen, who then went out on his own. They did a lot of the glass that you see in buildings here in the teens and 20s and early 30s. This happens to be a skylight for the tulip room at the Leopold Hotel in Bellingham, which is no longer there. There were exhibitions by women's societies, Portland Art Association, really an opportunity to show off the work of locals and of people in the national scene. And of the people who were doing that, nobody had a stronger connection with that than Julia Hoffman. This is one of the leading founders of the Arts and Crafts Society in Portland. We did not have an Arts and Crafts Society in Seattle per se. Julia Hoffman had been a friend of a lot of the arts and crafts designers in Boston, which had the first Arts and Crafts Society. And she wanted to bring their work to Portland, and so in 1907 she hosted an exhibition. She arranged personally with the artists to bring out their work. This Gruby vase is probably one of hers that was in the exhibit. She was an accomplished weaver and silversmith. She really practiced what the arts and crafts was all about, is creating your own pieces and learning the art. She was a little disappointed, I think, in the fact that most of the people who came to the events were really not participants actively creating, but more the audience coming to watch and to buy. And that was somewhat disillusioning for her. Her daughter actually was the lead person responsible for hiring and monitoring the artists and craftspeople who completed Timberline Lodge in Mount Hood. In Seattle, though we didn't have a society per se, we did have a number of people who were teaching the Bush School downtown. She had artists, mostly women. And then across the street from her was the Beaux-Arts Workshop, which started in a downtown studio, training people. And then, of course, it was their intent to eventually build an atelier, a studio building at Beaux-Arts Village on Lake Washington, but that never did come to pass. One of our finest metal workers was a person who came from England, studied in Rhode Island School of Design. His name was Albert Berry, and he came out to Alaska and opened up a craft shop with his soon-to-be wife, who also was an artist. The Albert Berry Handcraft Shop was known for hammered copper objects using fossilized ivory. And then they moved down to Seattle and opened up a shop, and we're here into the 50s, and really producing very unusual, unique objects that people seem to love, despite the fact that people weren't buying arts and crafts necessarily after the 20s or 30s. They kept coming back for more. An article in a 1921 issue of Seattle Town Crier reported, "There is at the Berry Handcraft Shop a pervading atmosphere of artistry and goodwill, making one feel the truth of the old saying that art is the expression of a man's joy in his work." So there were other people doing metal work. There was the Meyer Company, who was actually doing souvenir spoons and typical stuff, traditional stuff, but they did do some beautiful hand-hammered pieces on commission. This is a family piece that was done as a coffee set. This is another Portlander, Florence Knowlton, and she came to Portland in 1907. She exhibited at that first society event, and then she opened up a handcraft shop and worked really hard to promote and sell her work, but others' work. She's been quoted as saying, "Surely 9 out of 10 of those enthusiasts who think that this is easy would change their minds if they followed any good piece of handiwork from start to finish." It was hard work. Then there were the manual and applied arts programs in the schools. Washington and Oregon were very progressive in those early days of the 20th century, and they really had instruction in every facet of design. Jewelry making and metal were one of them. There were also tile manufacturers that were national, that were represented by tile showrooms in Seattle and Portland and elsewhere. These are some special commission pieces that are shown in an advertisement. This happens to be in a house on Queen Anne Hill, Knight in Shining Arbor, doing jousting. And this one was in the Oregon Hotel, and you can see Mount Hood in the background. So these were special commissions. So was the Rookwood Tile Italian Garden in the Sorrento Hotel. This is one of the crimes of the century. This was in the New Washington Hotel, which is now senior housing, called the Josephinum. And this was the Totem Lounge. And here's Mount Rainier. Here are these wonderful corbels looking like Native American masks. There are totems on either side, and there's this stylized evergreen trees on either side. All of that is done in Rookwood tile, and all of that was taken away and dumped in probably the 50s or 60s. Some things still survive. This is a view of the Columbia River in the Leary House in Capitol Hill. This is a California tile manufacturer who actually looked at Crater Lake and Multnomah Falls in Oregon as inspiration for their tiles. And then this happens to be a study in watercolor by Kirkland Cutter of probably a dining room frieze, where he's tried to tie the frieze with the tiles that would be in the fireplace. There was a company, and you can see it, the Washington Brick, Lime, and Sewer Pipe Company, out of Eastern Washington, that decided that tile was popular in homes and they would get into the tile making business. And so they did, but they felt like their name might be off-putting to people who were looking for artistic tile. So they called their tile brand Waco. And some of their tile is very reminiscent of, and actually lifted bodily from some of the designs of better-known tile maker, Botschelter, down in Los Angeles. But we had all the major manufacturers here, partly because of the fairs, partly because of distribution. All of them were advertising locally. We also had women who either had time on their hands and wanted to feel productive or wanted to make a little extra money, and china painting became a very popular avocation, hobby in those days. You could go and buy blanks of Belique or Limoges or any foreign brand of china that would be blank, and you would paint it. And there were instructions. There was Ceramics magazine, which came out monthly, which told you how to do these things, and published. These happened to be published in Ceramics magazine. These were from the Portland Ceramics Society, which was a group of women who had started working. And I think the comment in the magazine was that they were reaching a respectable point in their designs. But here you have huge amounts of stuff produced in the school system. This happens to be in Oregon. There was manual training programs in the colleges, the agricultural colleges. Oregon State University in Corvallis, and it gives you a sense of the great variety of production that they did. While it wasn't really the center of publishing, there were a number of companies that were producing really handsome, what we'd call arts and crafts inspired graphics and printing pieces. This is just an assortment from various places, Oregon and Washington. One of the best of the book designers was Will Ransom. He brought the spirit of Roycroft to a little shop he had in Snohomish. And it wasn't very long-lived. It was 1901. He did this marvelous book called The Lady of Shalott. It was based on Tennyson's poem. And in the front of the book, he explains his venture. He says, "A love for beautiful books and a slight knowledge of the technical processes of their making have created in me a desire to build some volumes by the labor of mine own hands. The creative instinct has ever been strong within me, and while the possession of that instinct does not always imply the creative ability, and it urges me to the effect without thought for the results. Therefore, here have I established in Snohomish, Washington, what it has pleased me to term the handcraft shop, wherein, from time to time, I shall print by hand a few books, each one as beautifully as may be in my power. And that really is the essence of arts and crafts, is it's for everyone to be an appreciator and to experiment, and without the sense that somebody's going to criticize you. There were woodworkers, there were furniture people, but there were also artists who were doing woodblock prints. They were inspired by Japanese woodblock prints. This is Corwin Chase. This is Elizabeth Colburn working out of Bellingham. She studied in New York, and she worked in New York as an illustrator for years. She came back to teach in the normal school, which is now Western Washington University, and her talent was in capturing the sense of place in beautiful woodblock prints that were not very big. The one on the left is actually similar to a poster stamp. It's maybe 2.5 by 3.5 inches. And the Cedar Swamp is much larger. It's probably about 9 by 12. There was an exhibit of her work in Bellingham a number of years ago, and there's a lovely catalog to that. Photography. Everybody was doing photography. If you had a Kodak, you could take pictures. But there were a number of artists in the Northwest who really were seeking to work in what they called the pictorialist motif, which was to make the photograph look like art. Some of them were a little fuzzy, some of them were ambiance more than subject matter. Imogen Cunningham is probably the one you know best in that, because she did gain a national reputation that has stayed. And this is her husband, Roy Partridge, posing nude on Mount Rainier. Some say that's probably the reason why they moved to San Francisco a few years later, but I don't think that's actually the truth. Scandal being what it was, there might have been a little bit of an uproar, but not a whole lot. And then on the right, the flower is actually a woman. Her name was Emma Mcbride. She was really instrumental in the development of the Seattle Camera Club in 1924. Some of my favorite images are these. This is 7:05 a.m. This is the train coming through Seattle in a hazy morning, and you can see the Smith Tower only as a shadow behind it. This is by Frank Kunishiki. And then the other one on the right is by Wayne Albee, another very atmospheric view of the Seattle waterfront. And I suppose everybody really knows about Mr. Curtis, the other Curtis. I'm more familiar with Aishel Curtis, who did all these marvelous photographs of Seattle and environs for many people. But Edward Curtis certainly gained a reputation for his view of Native Americans and perhaps a little bit romantic picturing of them. I mean, how romantic is this? There were also a number of artists who we think of, when we talk about Impressionism in America, well, there's the California Impressionist, all the plein air artists. We had them up here. They just haven't gotten their due yet. So this is Henry Wentz, who was one of the founders of the Portland Art Museum. This is C.C. McKim, this is a view of, it's hard to say this is a view of Mount Hood, but you can't really see Mount Hood because it's one of our hazy days. And then this is a Washingtonian. This is Paul Morgan Gustin, who's quoted as saying, "I try to paint not only what I actually see with my eyes in the landscape, but what I feel in the landscape, the sense of freedom or of quiet or of freshness." So I hope that what I've shown you this morning is just a sense of the variety that flourished in the Pacific Northwest in terms of this fertile movement to get away from tradition and find one's own way in arts, in building, in interiors. Some of it's gone, some of it's not visible. This was a period when people, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people got rid of the things that their parents bought and owned and tossed and put in the attic. They're thrown out, they got burned for firewood, they got replaced to sell. When you're in the Depression, you sold things. So a lot of these things have disappeared. The buildings themselves are really the most solid extant representation of the style, because there are bungalows and craftsman homes by the thousands in these communities. I think for Glenn and me, when we were working on the book, our take was that, you know, some people might look at the stuff that we had pulled for our exhibit or for the book and said, oh, well, it's been done better here or there or another place. But really, if they do, they're missing the point of the arts and crafts movement, which was the fact that so many regional companies manufactured and sold their furnishings here, that people built and lived in bungalows, that school children learned craft and art and things they could be proud of as they grew up, that hobbyists, laborers, society, women, and art workers expressed themselves with objects of beauty and utility would ultimately be more important than the products themselves. People gained a respect for handcraft, self-taught skills, and a sense that they could create beauty around them with very little except their own ingenuity. So the world changed, and it changed their worldview, I think. I was pleased when a review of our book came out years ago in Bungalow magazine, because the editor, John Luke, actually got what we were trying to do. He said, most notably, they have restored a particular kind of balance to a story that has elsewhere tended to inflate into a grand narrative of ultimate bungalows and the celebration of $25,000 vases, leaving behind the more modest but vastly more influential tale of changes in the way people lived as an American middle-class culture began to form. They have framed the tale as a regional one, but it can also be read as simply an American one with more rain and taller trees. So I don't know how many of you ever had an opportunity to go to the exhibit at the Museum of History and Industry. It was a wonderful experience for us to actually gather together all these marvelous materials and share it with the community. It traveled from Seattle to Spokane and Tacoma and Bellingham. But you do live in a neighborhood and in a community where if you drive any length of time, probably into the older sections of the suburban cities, you will find bungalows wherever you go and arts and crafts homes. So maybe from now on you'll be a little bit more alert to what your environment is full of, and the next time you see a permit to tear down something, you might think, how important is it to our community to keep that as a vestige of a past time that was very important in our growth? Thank you.